Buried century, the last Comstock miner who reached the 3,000-foot level in 1879. What he found down there. In 1879, a miner named Thomas Watkins descended to the 3,000-foot level of the Comstock Lode in Nevada. What he found down there would be recorded in company logs, then buried in archives for over a century. Perfectly carved chambers, stone masonry that predated any mining operation, and artifacts that shouldn't exist in a silver mine at all. The official story says the Comstock Lode was discovered in 1859 by two Irish prospectors. The revised story says something else entirely, that what miners called discovery was actually excavation, that the silver wasn't deposited by volcanic activity, that the tunnels at the deepest levels were already there when the first picks broke through. This is the story of what happened when one man went deeper than anyone had gone before, and what the mining companies did to make sure nobody ever went that deep again. If you want to understand why certain parts of American history don't add up, hit subscribe, because the stories they buried underground are starting to surface. The story of the Comstock Lode doesn't begin in 1859. It begins centuries earlier in the oral traditions of the Washoe people who inhabited the western edge of the Great Basin. They knew the mountain held something valuable, but they also knew it held something forbidden. Their elders passed down stories of the mountain's interior, of passages that descended into darkness, of rooms built by hands that came before. The Washoe didn't mind the mountain, they avoided it. Thomas Watkins wasn't supposed to be in the Comstock at all. Born in Wales in 1834, he'd worked the coal mines of Merthyr Tydfil since he was 8 years old. The Welsh coal mines were among the deepest in the world at that time. By 20, he'd survived 2 cave-ins and witnessed a gas explosion that killed 11 men in a single shift. When he emigrated to California in 1856, he'd already spent 22 years underground. He understood the language of rock. He could predict collapses by the sound of settling earth. And more importantly, he knew when something didn't belong. The Comstock Lode sits beneath Virginia City, Nevada. In the official narrative, it was discovered accidentally when 2 Irish miners, Patrick McLaughlin and Peter O'Reilly, were digging for water and struck silver instead. Within months, the rush was on. By 1863, the Comstock had produced over $30 million in silver. By 1879, it had produced over 300 million. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The deeper the miners went, the stranger things became. At shallow depths, everything made sense. Silver ore mixed with gold, typical quartz formations, but past 2,000 feet the rock changed, the tunnels changed, sections of tunnel wall that were too smooth, chambers that opened into spaces far larger than any mining operation would create, and occasionally objects embedded in rock that had no business being there. Watkins arrived in Virginia City in 1864, hired by the Consolidated Virginia Mining Company. For the first 10 years, he worked standard shifts at standard depths, 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet. The heat at those depths could reach 130 degrees. Men worked 20-minute shifts before rotating out. It was brutal, but it was expected. What bothered him wasn't the heat or the danger, it was the inconsistencies. A section of wall that was too flat, a corner that met at an angle too precise for pickaxe work, drill holes that seemed to follow an existing pattern. One older miner, a man named Halloran, pulled Watkins aside and told him to stop asking questions. Halloran had worked the 2,000-foot level in 1867. He'd seen things down there, things the company didn't want discussed. A week after he reported what he saw, he was reassigned to surface work. In 1874, Watkins was promoted to shift supervisor. That's when he started noticing discrepancies in the company logs. Certain shafts would be marked as unstable with no explanation. Entire sections would disappear from updated maps. The answer was always cave-ins, gas pockets, standard hazards. But when Watkins examined the sealed sections himself, he found something different. The blockages weren't natural collapses. They were deliberate. Someone had filled these passages with rubble and concrete. Someone wanted to make sure nobody went deeper. In 1877, the Consolidated Virginia reached 2,800 feet. The newspapers celebrated it as a triumph, but the company logs told a different story. The drill bits started hitting something harder than silver ore, something that resisted the cutting edges in ways no natural rock should. The bits were breaking at an unusual rate. Core samples were extracted with difficulty. They showed rock that was millions of years older than the surrounding formations, and they showed evidence of exposure to extreme heat. Not volcanic heat, something more controlled, the kind that smelting operations produced. And there were marks, microscopic striations running in parallel lines, too regular to be natural. The on-site geologist examined them under magnification and wrote that they appeared to be tool marks of unknown origin. The samples were sent to San Francisco for analysis. The report came back confirming the rock showed signs of tooling. Not modern tooling, not even 19th century tooling, something else. The chief engineer, Robert Graves, recommended halting operations until a proper investigation could be conducted. He wanted specialists from the Smithsonian. The company ignored him. They had investors to satisfy and profitable silver to extract. Graves was removed from the project 2 months later. His replacement, William Sutro, had a background in finance, not geology. His job was to keep the mine producing. In March 1879, Watkins received an unusual assignment. The company wanted to push past 3,000 feet, not for silver extraction, for exploration. They needed someone experienced, someone who could handle the heat and pressure at that depth, someone who could document what was down there without panicking or spreading stories that would spook the other miners, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Watkins accepted. But he kept his own records, and those records survived. The descent to 3,000 feet took 6 hours. The elevator system could only go so deep before the cables became too dangerous. The weight of 3,000 feet of steel cable was enough to snap the connections at lower depths. Below 2,500 feet, miners used a series of ladders bolted into the rock face. Watkins descended in near total darkness, his lamp casting shadows on walls that glistened with moisture. The temperature climbed steadily. By the time he reached the staging platform at 2,900 feet, it was 145 degrees. The air was thick. Breathing required conscious effort. Each inhale brought superheated air mixed with mineral dust and the acrid smell of sulfur compounds released by the surrounding rock. Watkins had brought extra water, but even that was warm by the time he reached the staging platform. He poured some over his head, felt it evaporate almost instantly, then continued down. The platform was empty. No other miners, no equipment, just a single rope ladder leading down into a vertical shaft that hadn't appeared on any map Watkins had seen. The ladder looked new, recently installed. Someone had been down here before him preparing the way, but there was no indication of who or when. He tested the ladder. Solid. The bolts were driven deep into rock that felt different from everything above. Harder. Denser. He made a mental note and descended. The shaft was perfectly vertical, not following a natural fissure or fault line, not angling to follow an ore vein, just straight down through solid rock. Watkins counted the rungs as he descended. At 53 rungs, approximately 100 feet below the staging platform, the shaft opened into a chamber. Not a natural cave, not a mining excavation, a chamber. The walls were smooth, too smooth. The corners were perfect 90-degree angles. The ceiling was vaulted, supported by what looked like stone arches. And in the center of the chamber there was a door. Watkins lit a second lamp and held both up to get a better view. The chamber was roughly 40 feet across and 20 feet high. The floor was level. Not approximately level, the way a mined-out chamber might be after debris was cleared. Perfectly level. He knelt and ran his hand across the surface. It was smooth, polished, like the floor of a building, not the bottom of a mine shaft. The walls showed no pickaxe marks, no drill holes, no evidence of the violent excavation process that created every other chamber in the Comstock, just smooth stone surfaces that met at precise angles. The arches supporting the ceiling were carved from single pieces of stone, not assembled from smaller blocks. The craftsmanship was beyond anything Watkins had seen in 2 decades of mining across 3 continents. Watkins recorded every detail in his notebook. The door was made of a dark metal that his lamp couldn't quite illuminate. No rust, no corrosion, just smooth dark metal set into a stone frame. There were markings around the frame. Not English, not Spanish, not any language Watkins recognized. The symbols were geometric, precise. Some looked like mathematical notation. Others resembled astronomical diagrams. Still others defied any classification Watkins could attempt. He tried the door. It didn't budge, not locked, not stuck, simply immovable. He examined the edges where the door met the frame. No visible hinges, no handles, no obvious mechanism for opening. The door and frame appeared to be a single continuous surface, the metal flowing seamlessly into the stone with no gap or seam. He examined the walls. The stone was granite, but not the volcanic granite that made up the rest of the Comstock. This was older, denser. It had a different crystalline structure visible under the lamplight, and it had been cut with precision that Watkins had never seen in 2 decades of mining. No pickaxe marks, no drill holes, just smooth, perfectly flat surfaces that met at exact angles. The more Watkins looked, the more details emerged. The arches supporting the ceiling weren't just carved, they were engineered. The weight distribution was perfect. The stone was under compression in exactly the right places. Whoever built this chamber understood structural mechanics at a level that matched or exceeded contemporary engineering knowledge. In one corner of the chamber, Watkins found a pile of debris. Not mining debris, not the rubble of broken rock and discarded equipment that accumulated in every working mine. This was different, broken pottery. Fragments of what looked like glass, but heavier and more opaque than any glass Watkins had seen. The fragments had a crystalline structure that reminded him of obsidian, but the edges were too smooth, too regular. And something else. A piece of metal worked into a shape that served no obvious function. It was roughly circular, about 8 inches in diameter and half an inch thick. The edges were beveled. The surface was covered with intricate patterns etched so finely that Watkins needed to hold his lamp close to see the details. The patterns weren't decorative. They had purpose, mathematical precision. Some looked like star charts, others resembled mechanical diagrams, still others showed geometric relationships that Watkins couldn't interpret. He turned the object over. The reverse side showed similar patterns but different configurations, as if the object was meant to be read from both sides, or as if it recorded information in layers. Watkins had seen nothing like it. Not in any museum, not in any technical manual, not in any archaeological collection he'd encountered in his limited travels. He pocketed it. Then he continued his examination of the chamber. He spent 3 hours in that chamber, documenting everything he could, the dimensions, the construction, the door, the artifacts. He measured the walls with a length of rope he'd brought for exactly this purpose, 42 feet across, 23 feet high. The floor was perfectly level to within a degree or two. He checked it by rolling a metal ball he'd brought as a test. The ball didn't roll in any direction. Perfect level. He examined the ceiling. The vaulted arches met at a central keystone carved with a symbol that looked like a sunburst, or a star, or something else entirely. The carving was deep, deliberate. It hadn't weathered or eroded despite what must have been considerable time at depth, in the presence of moisture and geological pressure. He checked the air. Despite being 3,000 feet underground, the chamber didn't feel stagnant. There was airflow, slight but noticeable, coming from somewhere, going somewhere. He traced it with his lamp flame. The air was moving toward the door, as if the chamber was part of a larger system, as if opening the door would reveal passages beyond. But he couldn't open the door. And after 3 hours his water was running low and the heat was becoming unbearable. He climbed back up. When he reached the surface, the shift manager was waiting for him. The man's name was Porter, and he looked nervous. Not the usual tension that came with managing dangerous operations at extreme depth. Something else. Fear. Porter was afraid of what Watkins might have found. He asked Watkins what he'd seen. Watkins told him every detail: the chamber, the door, the artifacts, the evidence of deliberate construction. Porter went pale. He told Watkins to write nothing down, to speak to no one, to report directly to the company office in the morning. Then he walked away without another word. Watkins didn't sleep that night. He sat in his rented room and wrote everything he remembered. Measurements, observations, sketches of the symbols he'd seen around the doorframe, descriptions of the artifacts. He filled 12 pages of his notebook with details while they were still fresh in his mind. Then he hid the notebook under a loose floorboard and waited for morning. 2 days later, Watkins was summoned to the company office. 3 men were waiting for him. One was William Sutro, the chief engineer. One was a lawyer from San Francisco whose name Watkins never learned. And one was a man in a dark suit who introduced himself as a representative of the United States Geological Survey. His credentials looked legitimate. His presence felt wrong. They asked Watkins to describe what he'd seen. He did, carefully, leaving out certain details. The notebook was still hidden. The artifact was in his pocket. He told them about the chamber, the door, the construction quality, the symbols, but he minimized his observations, made them sound less significant than they were. Sutro interrupted him halfway through, asked if Watkins understood the nature of geological formations at extreme depth, explained that pressure and heat could create unusual rock patterns, that minerals could crystallize in ways that mimicked artificial structures, that the human mind, under stress in extreme conditions, often saw patterns where none existed. Watkins nodded politely and continued his description. The lawyer took notes. The man from the Geological Survey said nothing. When Watkins finished, there was a long silence. Then the lawyer asked if Watkins had taken anything from the chamber. Watkins lied and said no. The lawyer asked if he told anyone else what he'd found. Watkins lied again and said no. The man from the Geological Survey watched him the entire time with an expression that suggested he knew both answers were false. Then the Geological Survey man leaned forward. He told Watkins that what he'd found was a natural formation, a cave system that had been exposed by the mining operations. The door was a mineral deposit, a concentration of metal-rich ore that had crystallized in an unusual shape. The artifacts were concretions, geological curiosities with no historical significance, natural formations that resembled manufactured objects due to the peculiar mineralogy of the Comstock Formation. The explanation was absurd. Watkins had worked underground long enough to know the difference between natural formations and artificial structures. He'd seen countless cave systems. He'd encountered mineral deposits in every conceivable configuration. What he'd found at 3,000 feet was neither of these things. But Watkins also knew when to keep his mouth shut. He nodded, agreed with everything they said, thanked them for clarifying the situation, assured them he understood that what he'd seen was nothing more than a geological curiosity, something to mention in passing to fellow miners, but nothing worth reporting to newspapers or scientific journals. The lawyer seemed satisfied. Sutro relaxed. But the man from the Geological Survey continued watching Watkins with that same knowing expression, as if he understood exactly what Watkins was doing, as if he'd given the same explanation to other miners who'd seen similar things at similar depths, as if this conversation was a script he'd performed many times before. The next week, the 3,000-foot level was permanently sealed. The official reason was unstable rock formations, but Watkins kept his notes, and he kept the artifact. After the meeting, Watkins went to the Virginia City Library and started researching. The Washoe people had stories about the mountain. They called it a sacred place because of what was underneath. The elders spoke of the old ones who lived below. They spoke of tunnels that went deeper than any man should go, and they spoke of a prohibition. The mountain was not to be disturbed. When the first prospectors arrived in the 1850s, the Washoe warned them. The mountain was dangerous, not because of cave-ins, because of what slept beneath it. The prospectors ignored the warnings. Watkins found archived correspondence from an 1840s missionary who'd lived with the Washoe. The missionary described their beliefs about the mountain in detail. The Washoe claimed the tunnels beneath were built by a people who came before, a people who knew how to work stone and metal in ways the Washoe never mastered, a people who went deep into the earth for reasons the Washoe couldn't explain. In 1862, 3 years after the Comstock discovery, miners at 1,500 feet broke through into a room of worked stone. They reported it. The company sent an engineer to investigate. His report described the room in detail: 20 feet square, walls of cut granite meeting at precise angles, floor level to within 1 degree. The report concluded it was likely a natural cavity and sealed it to prevent confusion among the workforce. In 1868, another crew at 2,000 feet found similar chambers, 3 of them connected by carved tunnels. Same response: documented, described as natural formations, then sealed. By 1879, Watkins realized he wasn't the first to find evidence of pre-existing structures. He was just the first to document it thoroughly and keep physical evidence. The artifact became his obsession. He took it to a metallurgist in San Francisco named Friedrich Bauer. Bauer examined it for 2 weeks. The metal wasn't any standard alloy. It showed traces of elements that shouldn't appear together in natural formations. The combination required deliberate smelting techniques unlike anything in contemporary practice. The etch patterns were functional, mathematical. Some resembled star charts, but with constellations that didn't match known celestial configurations. Others showed geometric relationships Bauer recognized from advanced mathematics but couldn't explain practically. Watkins tried the Smithsonian. His letter went unanswered. He tried the American Antiquarian Society. Same result. He tried private collectors. Most ignored him. In 1881, a man named Edward Thompson approached him. Thompson was a surveyor who'd worked on railroad projects, but his real interest was archaeology. He'd heard rumours about the Comstock, about chambers and artefacts found at depth. Watkins showed him everything. Thompson examined it with the intensity of a man who'd been searching for exactly this evidence. He told Watkins he'd seen similar artefacts before, in Arizona, in New Mexico, in southern Colorado, always at depth, always quickly suppressed, always dismissed as hoaxes when they couldn't be hidden entirely. Thompson had documented over 30 separate incidents across the Western Territories, chambers, artifacts, evidence of metalworking and stone carving that predated accepted timelines by thousands of years. He'd tried to publish his findings. No journal would accept them. He'd tried to organize expeditions. No institution would fund them. Thompson believed the artifacts were evidence of a civilization that existed in North America thousands of years before the accepted timeline, a civilization that built underground, that mined at depths modern equipment could barely reach, and that left behind structures so well built they survived whatever catastrophe erased them from the surface. In 1883, the Comstock began its decline. The deeper deposits were too expensive to work. One by one, the mines shut down. By 1886, Virginia City's population dropped from 15,000 to fewer than 3,000. The Consolidated Virginia sold its assets. All records were transferred. All sealed sections were to remain sealed. Watkins left Nevada in 1884. He moved to Oregon but couldn't let go of what he'd found. In 1889, a geologist named Charles Walcott agreed to examine the artifact. Walcott worked with the United States Geological Survey and had credentials that commanded respect. He examined the artifact for 3 months at the Smithsonian laboratories. His report confirmed everything. The metal composition was anomalous, the craftsmanship was sophisticated, the mathematical patterns included calculations for planetary orbits and geometric relationships that anticipated concepts from advanced mathematics. Walcott submitted his report to the Geological Survey in December 1889. It was reviewed. Then it disappeared. Watkins never received a response. Walcott never published his findings. When Watkins tried to contact him in 1890, Walcott's assistant said Mr. Walcott was no longer accepting inquiries on that subject. Years later, after Walcott became secretary of the Smithsonian, Watkins made one final attempt. His letter was returned with a note stating, Walcott had no record of any such examination. Watkins spent his final years in Portland. He never stopped writing about what he'd found. He filled notebooks with observations and theories. He corresponded with Edward Thompson until Thompson's death in 1898. He wrote to newspapers. They dismissed him. He wrote to universities. No responses. The narrative had solidified. Any stories about ancient chambers were the delusions of men who'd spent too much time underground. Thomas Watkins died in 1903. His daughter Margaret inherited his notes and kept them in her attic for 50 years. In 1954, she donated them to the Oregon Historical Society. They sat in storage until 1987, when researcher Michael Cremo found them while investigating anomalous archaeological finds. Cremo published excerpts in his 1993 book, Forbidden Archaeology. The academic community dismissed it. But the precision of Watkins' observations and the consistency of his account across 2 decades suggested something more than delusion. The artifact was never found. It vanished along with whatever answers it might have provided. But the chamber is still there, 3,000 feet below Virginia City, sealed behind rubble. The door is there, the worked stone is there, and whatever lies beyond is waiting. In 2003, researchers attempted to access the sealed sections. They were denied. Safety concerns, structural instability, liability issues. In 2011, ground-penetrating radar detected anomalous cavities at depth beneath the old Comstock district. Large, regular cavities that didn't match any known mining pattern. The University of Nevada recommended further investigation. The recommendation was declined. In 2018, a documentary crew tried to get permission. They offered to cover costs and assume liability. Still denied. The pattern is clear. Access is blocked at every level. Every attempt to investigate is met with obstacles that sound reasonable, but collapse under scrutiny. Safety concerns that apply selectively. Liability issues that could be addressed. Structural instability claims that contradict engineering assessments. The question isn't whether something is down there. The ground-penetrating radar proves cavities exist. The historical records prove miners found artificial structures. The question is why access keeps getting denied, why the records keep disappearing, and why a story that should be a historical curiosity has been systematically suppressed for over 140 years. The question isn't whether something is down there. The evidence suggests something is. The question is why access keeps getting denied, why the records keep disappearing, and why a story that should be a historical curiosity has been systematically suppressed for over 140 years. Thomas Watkins went down to 3,000 feet in 1879 and found something that challenged the accepted narrative of American history. He documented it, he preserved it, and he spent the rest of his life trying to make someone care. The mining companies didn't care about history, they cared about profit. The geological surveys didn't care about anomalies, they cared about consensus. And the academic institutions didn't care about evidence that contradicted the established timeline, so the chambers stayed sealed, the artifacts stayed hidden, and the story of what's really under the American West stayed buried. But stories have a way of resurfacing. Records get digitized, archives get opened, and people start asking questions that don't have easy answers. Questions like, if the Comstock miners were the first to dig that deep, why did they keep finding rooms that were already there? If the artifacts were just mineral deposits, why were they confiscated and hidden? And if the chambers were natural formations, why did they have doors? The official story says the Comstock Lode was discovered in 1859. The revised story says it was excavated. that the silver rush wasn't about discovering new resources. It was about accessing old ones, resources that had been mined before by someone else at a scale and depth that shouldn't have been possible with the technology of the time. And the deepest question of all, if there was a civilization advanced enough to build at 3,000 feet, where did they go? What happened to them? And what did they leave behind that we're still not allowed to see? Thomas Watkins found a door at the bottom of the Comstock, a door made of metal that doesn't corrode, set in stone that was cut with precision we still struggle to replicate, leading to something that terrified the mining companies enough to seal it forever. The door is still there, waiting, 3,000 feet below a ghost town in Nevada. And until someone decides that truth matters more than narrative, it's going to stay closed. That's the story they didn't want told, the story of the last Comstock miner who went deeper than anyone should have gone, and what he found when he got there. If this kind of suppressed history interests you, there's more where this came from. The architecture they're calling flood remnants, the tunnels under major cities that predate their founding dates, the artifacts pulled from coal seams that are millions of years older than human civilization is supposed to be. That video is on your screen right now. Click it. Because the deeper you dig, the stranger the official story gets.